Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our final lecture of the semester. Tonight, we're going to talk briefly about policy, sustainability, and the future. And I'm probably not going to dive too far into how to live sustainably because there is so much information about this available to you on the web. You can look it up if you're interested in this, and I sincerely hope you are at this point in the semester. You can investigate this on your own. You can look for how to modify the way you purchase your food, how you grow food, how you operate vehicles. There's all sorts of ways you can look up online to discover how you can work towards sustainability. A good way to start is to understand what sustainability is. And sustainability here is defined as being able to meet our own needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. I want to emphasize this because it talks about needs. It talks about what you need to survive, not necessarily what you want to have to enjoy. And I'm as guilty of that as anybody else. So don't think I'm being critical here. Nevertheless, we're talking about what do you need to survive? What do you need to survive and thrive? Sustainability is about meeting those needs, achieving those ends without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And we've talked about a variety of resources that we use as a society, as a culture, as human beings that our way of life depends on, the way we do things depends on. The last lecture in particular was talking about fossil fuels and talking about that as a resource. And as we discussed, the resource has a number of drawbacks. Number one, the way we use it is actually creating greenhouse gases that are essentially poisoning our atmosphere. They're not just adding medic or physically harmful chemicals to the air, but they're also increasing the global warming that we see ongoing, which is going to have long-term dramatic effects on the way we live our lives. But what we also talked about last lecture is how petroleum and coal and natural gas are non-renewable resources. They are limited resources. And so the lifestyle that we enjoy being based on those resources, it's not going to go on indefinitely. It actually does have an end, possibly within your lifetimes, if not probably within your lifetimes, based on the current rate of consumption of these resources. And so if you think about petroleum and natural gas and coal, are these sustainable? Is it sustainable to use these resources to continue to support our way of life? And the answer is no. In the long term, because these resources are present in limited amounts and because they are non renewable resources, this is not sustainable. I really want to emphasize this point because there continue to be people who talk about how this is the way we've done things. We've always done it this way. This is how we get by. This is how we survive. That is not sustainable simply because the resource is present in limited amounts. Yes, there is more resource available than can currently be extracted, but any new technologies or additional energy expended to recover those resources is going to eventually, as we talked about last time, make the resources not profitable to recover. So eventually, one way or another, we are going to have to deal with this. At the present, there are a variety of approaches that have been suggested for moving away from fossil fuels and moving on to other sources of energy that might prove to be sustainable. One of these, I'm sure you're aware, would be wind power, where you use wind towers like those you see here and those you have probably seen in a variety of places in Southern and Northern California to generate electricity, to generate power. And because wind, depending on where you are, can be a relatively common resource, this should be a relatively sustainable way of doing things. So, is wind power sustainable? I would argue that yes, it is. That does not mean it's free. That does not mean that it doesn't have repercussions, but it does mean that since wind is going to be going on and going on for years and centuries and millennia to come, because that's just the nature of atmospherics on planet Earth, you can depend on that resource, and it is simply harnessing that resource and using it to generate energy. So Is this sustainable? Yes, it is. It's unsightly, but then so are power lines like some of the neighborhoods I grew up in. And you just get used to this sort of thing. You look at this picture, especially if you're living in a neighborhood that doesn't have these power lines all over the place, where maybe your power lines are buried, and this looks a little unsightly. I would agree this looks unsightly, but I've grown up with it and I'm kind of used to it, and I generally look right past it. I think that that's what future generations are probably going to do with some of these giant windmills. Yes, we're going to see them. They're going to be new, they're going to be different, and they're going to be kind of ugly to look at. But future generations will simply be used to them because they've always been there. That's the way they will have always done things. And so this may be our future, and this may be a good way to help wean us from reliance on fossil fuels. There are other challenges that come with wind power. And one of these, again, you've probably heard of, where you have birds who don't see the windmills because the blades of the windmills are turning. And even though they're giant and might look like they're turning slowly, in fact, they're turning pretty quickly. And so birds can impact these and be killed. And so that is a serious environmental concern, particularly since many migratory birds fly through regions where there are high winds, where you would expect to install these windmills. And so you're going to have a conflict there between the wildlife and the energy generating facilities. That said, there are biologists and other scientists who are studying this right now, looking at windmills, looking at how they can be lit, looking at how birds respond to different stimuli. And it turns out different species of birds respond differently to different stimuli. Um, but looking at that and how can we make these windmills more avoidable? So that research is actually ongoing. So these are not reasons not to invest in wind power. These are reasons to recognize that wind power is a reliable source of energy in the long term because it's renewable, but there are costs associated with it that need to be dealt with, that need to be addressed. And again, that research is ongoing. Other sources of energy that are renewable would be solar energy. Some of you may work or live in facilities that have solar panels and derive their energy from solar panel power. I know my wife and I actually, uh, over a decade ago, had solar panels installed on our home. So the majority of our energy in our house, including the energy I'm using to record this lecture right now, come from our own roof. They come from solar panels that we've installed. So we aren't consuming uh, non-renewable resources to generate energy. We are using renewable energy. And so solar energy is the potential for that. In fact, I have this daydream that we might take advantage of this in the future. Sorry, I forgot that I'd added. Is solar energy sustainable? As long as the sun is out, yes, it absolutely is. And yes, there are storage batteries that can be used to trap that energy and store it for periods where there is less sunlight. So this is sustainable. Here's the slide I was leading up to. I have this vision of owning an electric vehicle and being able to drive all the way around town, go to work, come home, go shopping, do whatever I need to do, come home at night, plug in the vehicle. It's taking energy out of our solar panels, out of our own personal electrical grid. The next day, the car is fully charged. Off we go. That's the daydream. I don't know that it's going to happen. I'm showing you here a projected VW van that is supposed to be available, I believe, in the year 2022. It's supposed to get up to 300 miles per charge. And so this would be great. And I would love to have one of these because ever since I was a little kid, I always loved VW vans. The challenge is this is expected to cost between $40,000 and $60,000. And as you know, I am a part-time instructor at Cal State, so I'm never going to be able to afford this. So I'm probably going to have to get by on something much cheaper or something used or something that still consumes gas, but that consumes less gas. Nevertheless, the more of these vehicles that are developed, the more of these vehicles that are produced, the more the cost will go down. It's the cost adjustment due to scale. If you're mass producing these things, their cost is going to go down rather than prototypes like you see here that are remarkably expensive. So hopefully within another 10, 20, 30 years, electric vehicles will be so common that they will be affordable. And you won't need to, take a mortgage, a loan out against the mortgage of your home. You won't need to borrow against your student debt if that's even possible. You'll just be able to go out and buy a vehicle, and it'll be electric rather than gasoline powered. This doesn't mean that solar panels and solar power, like wind power, don't also come with some costs associated with them. And for those of you who might have driven out to Las Vegas, and as you come through the mountains and drop down into the Ivanpah Dry Lake Valley outside of Primm, Nevada, you've probably seen these giant solar towers there. And the impacts, at least one of the impacts of these towers, is the same as the impacts of the wind towers that we discussed earlier. They kill birds. And in this case, the birds don't hit them and fall to the ground dead. The birds don't even see it. They're simply flying along, and suddenly they hit that zone of heat that is radiating out from these towers, and the birds are literally vaporized. And I mean that absolutely literally. They just disappear. They never knew what hit them. This is a real issue. If this is the way you are going to collect solar power to generate energy, there are going to be impacts. And this is also something that engineers have been thinking about for literally decades. Is this the best way to generate solar energy? Are there more efficient ways to do it? That is still under investigation. But that, again, that is a cost associated with doing business. It doesn't mean that you don't investigate this, because solar energy is renewable as opposed to fossil fuel energy, which, as we demonstrated, is not going to last forever. It is a non-renewable resource. It is not going to hang around. So we do need to start thinking about other options. There are other challenges with wind power and solar power. For example, communities like this. This is the community of Whitehorse up in the Yukon Territory. And this is sunrise. This is the sun coming up in Whitehorse. And the reason I bring that up is because this is about 10:25, 10:30 in the morning, and the sun is just coming up because it's so far north, and because this was winter. This was early February. And the sun is going to go down between 4:30 and 5. So that's all the time that the sun is going to be up. So solar panels, solar power would be extremely impractical for being used up here. And wind power, there is wind there, but it is not a reliable source of wind. We talked about the uh, major wind corridors being where migratory birds fly. We know where those wind corridors are. Those are likely candidates for wind power. Yes, you could establish windmills here, but the wind is not a constant. It comes and goes. And so you're not going to be able to generate consistent energy. And so, how would you bring energy to this community? Would you establish power lines from somewhere else where you could have power, or from somewhere far to the south where you had more sunlight for most of the year so that you could generate that energy? All of that is going to take thought. All of that is going to take input. Beyond that, keep in mind what we've talked about with ecosystems and adding energy to them. It's not just energy from the foodstuffs, it's energy from outside that enables us to inhabit new spaces and move into areas that just by ourselves, without that addition of energy, we wouldn't be able to move into. And this is another one of those examples. Could people live here? A few, probably, yes, but not a community of, I believe Whitehorse has 25,000 people in it. That's a lot of people. And they depend on energy, and they depend on fossil fuels, not just for transportation, but also for things like heating, where you have fuel oil used to heat your home. And if you don't have that resource available, where's the heat for your home going to come from? And when you're talking about living in an area that drops well below freezing, into the negative digits during much of the winter part of the year, heating is essential for people to survive. And so that a fossil fuel product is going to be necessary unless you find something to replace it, which again is going to take energy. Now, I would emphasize, as we discussed in a previous lecture, that if you look how petroleum is being consumed today, as we discussed, the vast majority of it is being used for transportation. If you eliminate that use, you can see that only 3% of petroleum by sector globally is being used residentially. If you eliminate the transportation uses and a lot of the industrial uses, suddenly those fossil fuels have the potential to last for a much longer period of time because the rate of consumption has been dropped dramatically. And so, potentially, if you can move transportation and industry to a different source of energy, that frees up petroleum to continue to be used for heating in some of these remote areas. Again, this is something that requires planning. This is something that requires thinking and working it out in advance. Or it requires waiting for oil to become so expensive that we can't use it anymore, and then scrambling to come up with options pretty much with a gun to our heads, which we don't want to do. It's better to plan in advance, see the challenge coming, address it in advance, and make sure that you've worked out some of these issues long before the crisis really hits. Another industry that's going to be hugely hit by the reduction of fossil fuels is going to be aviation. It's going to be travel in general, but specifically air travel because airplanes require fuel. Jet airplanes require jet fuel derived from petroleum in order to fly. The picture I just showed you from Whitehorse, I was in Whitehorse because I flew there. If I hadn't flown there, I don't know how I would have gotten there. Maybe I could have driven there, but again, I'd still be consuming a petroleum-based resource. So many of the pictures I have shown you this year from Whitehorse just now, from Hawaii, from Africa, from the Galapagos, I got to all those places by flying. And that is not necessarily going to be an available way of travel in a short period of time. Keep in mind, people were able to visit other nations, other continents by sailing there and by taking boats. But in the way we live today, it's by flying. We depend on this. And if you're not going to have that fuel resource available, which, as we discussed last lecture, we aren't, then you need to come up with a new way of doing this. And as we mentioned, coal is not going to be an option, and natural gas is not going to be an option because they don't have enough of a kick to support this in the long term. Solar panels aren't going to do it, and wind power isn't going to do it. So this is something that really needs to be thought through to come up with another energy source that might help here. And it's not just our travel by air, it's also our shipping by air. And so all of this is stuff that needs to be addressed. And as we mentioned, it needs to be addressed in the next few decades. It needs to be addressed during your upcoming lifetimes. And we haven't even talked about military aircraft. If you think about the United States military today, one of our main naval features is aircraft carriers. The United States, I believe, has more aircraft carriers in its Navy than all other nations combined. And when I say aircraft carriers, that means they carry aircraft. And those aircraft are flying and they need jet fuel, which is petroleum based. All of that is called into question by this diminishing resource, which is why, despite what you may hear from some politicians, you hear the military taking this very seriously and realizing that this is a serious concern, not just in terms of global climate impacts, but also in terms of resource availability and resource security. And all of this is stuff that needs to be addressed. Now, you might also be wondering about the carrier itself, whether it is powered by petroleum, by fossil fuels. And in this case, according to the picture information that I found online, no, this is a nuclear powered aircraft carrier. So it is using nuclear power to get around. And nuclear power is something that I haven't really talked about in this entire semester, in part because I don't know a lot about it, but in part because the dangers of nuclear power are already obvious. Nuclear fission, which is where we currently get nuclear power, produces nuclear waste. It produces radioactive waste, and it's radioactive waste that is going to stay radioactive and therefore harmful to humans and other life forms for literally thousands of years. And at the moment, the only way we can think of to dispose of that waste is to bury it and to hide it away and bury it as deep as possible. And that is a short-term solution because you don't have a lot of areas where you might be able to bury it. And so this is something that has not been addressed, and that's why nuclear power has kind of become less popular over the past decade or two, because it produces a byproduct that is extremely environmentally and health-wise hazardous, and yet there's no other way to do it. Maybe someday they will have nuclear fusion. I know that when I was a kid in high school, we thought nuclear fusion was about 20 years away. Well, now I'm an old Cal State instructor, and nuclear fusion, if they're developing it, is still going to be 15, 20 years away if they follow current timelines and if they're successful. So that's one way of generating energy. But until we solve the waste problem, it's not an efficient way of doing things. And that doesn't even mention what happens when you have disasters, when nuclear plants fail, like the one at Fukushima in Japan, which was a massive failure of their nuclear facility, and the environmental and other repercussions from that catastrophe are still rebounding and echoing today. So, is nuclear a potential fuel source, a potential energy source? Yes, it is. But there are a number of environmental issues that need to be addressed. And I know when we talked about wind power, I mentioned that there are environmental hazards. When we talked about solar panels, there are environmental hazards. But these are things that are being reviewed and analyzed and discussed and hopefully solved right now. Whereas the challenges with nuclear power we have known about for many, many decades and have not really advanced any further in figuring out how to mitigate those impacts from the waste produced by nuclear fuel. And many of you are probably wondering, why are we talking about energy when this is a class in a biology department? And the name of the class, as you may remember from the beginning of the semester, this is Biology 3010, and this is the class known as Human Ecology. And the reason I come back to that is because I want to wrap this up talking about biology and talking about humans as biological organisms. When we talk about human ecology, we're talking about the systematic study of interactions between humans and their environment, or their environments, depending on where they live. And this is important because we are biological organisms. And so, despite our technology, despite our apparent separation from the natural world, as biological organisms, we nevertheless continue to follow some of the biological dictates that we inherit as being part of the biological community. We've talked about the 4 F's of evolutionary biology. There's feeding, there's fighting, there's fleeing, and there's reproduction. All of these are biological necessities. As a biological organism, you and I and everybody you know, we have to do all of these things, particularly feeding and reproduction. And it's that last one that I want to finish up with. Reproduction is part of what is driving everything that we just talked about, because there are 7 billion of us and counting on the planet. That is a staggering number of organisms who are consuming huge numbers of resources, both in terms of food and in terms of the energy that we use to sustain our way of life. And that is not going to change. Current estimates suggest that our population is going to continue to increase. How much? It's hard to tell. But right now, this is a 2019 report from the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs that projects that we might hit 10 or 11, maybe even 12 million people by the year 2100 on the planet. And all of them are going to continue to need more food resources and more energy resources. That's simply the way we are as biological organisms. In fact, even if we were to level off reproduction right now, this is from the same report, that even if fertility rates in high fertility countries were to fall immediately to only around 2 children per woman, there is still population momentum that would carry us well over 9 billion people on the planet. So our population is going to increase even if we stop, but I don't see anybody stopping. I don't see people saying we're not going to have any children at all. What we do see is global populations increasing. And so if you look at what's called here the medium variant, which shows growth due to fertility above the level required to balance mortality and yield zero growth, as well as improvements in survival, it's going to take us well over 10 billion people by the year 2100. Excuse me. And so when we talk about population, this brings us back to a concept that we have discussed multiple times for the semester and what I'm going to wind up with. Because I think personally, as a scientist, I think this is where it all depends is the concept of carrying capacity. And it's the size of a population that can be supported indefinitely based upon the available resources and services of the ecosystem. And remember that you are an ecosystem. And even if you live in a town or a community or a city, you're still living in an ecosystem. It might be modified by technology, but it remains an ecosystem. And what determines the population size, the carrying capacity of that ecosystem, is the available food and water and space. And we have talked about bringing food to where people are. We have talked about moving water in from other areas to where the people are. And of course, increasing space, both moving out horizontally and moving upwards vertically in terms of the way that we live and where people live. And so that carrying capacity, the resources available, then feeds into population size. How many people can be supported by that? And as we discussed in a previous lecture, if you increase the carrying capacity, which is shown here as the dashed line horizontal across the screen, if you increase that carrying capacity, it gives you the ability to increase your population as well. If food, water, and space are more available, then population size can increase as well. I mention this because I asked this actually on the last midterm, and some of you got this wrong. If you add energy from things like fossil fuels, can you increase population size? Yes, you absolutely can, because you are increasing the amount of space, you're increasing the energy needed to survive in given areas. So, yes, you can actually increase the carrying capacity of a given ecosystem. That said, population can also overshoot carrying capacity. And we talked about this. This is an eruptive growth curve or a Malthusian growth curve. And we're going to talk about him one last time before the semester's over. But this would be eruptive growth or Malthusian growth. You can bet that it's going to be on the final exam. But that's what happens when your population exceeds carrying capacity. And then there's a dieback and your numbers fall below the carrying capacity. And then they recover and then they shoot past the carrying capacity again, and then there's another dieback and so forth. We discussed this as a biological concept of eruptive growth. But here, what I want to ask is what happens if you, as an organism, artificially increase carrying capacity? What if instead of modulating your population size to fit carrying capacity, you modulate carrying capacity to fit your population size? And I think that is actually the story of human ecology. That is the story of we humans as biological organisms. When you go back to our early hominin ancestors using stone tools to increase their meat consumption, when you think about later hominins who brought in fire in order to warm themselves, in order to protect themselves, in order to cook food and release more nutrients and more energy from that food. When you talk about the development of more sophisticated stone tool technologies and later technologies to acquire more food, when you talk about the development of more sophisticated hunter-gathering techniques, which leads to the eventual development of agriculture, which leads to the eventual development of civilizations, which leads to the spread of those civilizations and the subsuming of other cultures globally, all of that is humans changing their carrying capacities, looking for new ways to gain new resources to support their growing populations. And so population size is both a consequence of carrying capacity, and it's also a driving force behind the innovation that humans have displayed to increase artificially that carrying capacity. When you think about the colonialists who traveled the world and exploited other cultures, that's what they were doing. They didn't sit at home and say, we're simply going to go out and exploit other cultures because it's fun. They were looking for additional sources of resources in order to support their own populations. And that is the story of humanity as we understand it today. It is changing carrying capacity, even though we don't think about it that like that. We're just looking for resources. We're just looking for more food, more land, more minerals, more oil, more whatever it is you're looking for. But essentially, you are looking for more larger carrying capacity in order to support your growing populations. And now, with 7 billion of us, we've really reached a critical point because the resource we depend on, fossil fuels, is limited. And we do not have a replacement that packs the same punch. Yes, we have solar panels. Yes, we have wind power. But are they able to fully replace oil? That is something that needs to be determined. That is how you moved from a quiet, sleepy community like what Britain used to be to the thriving metropolis that you now see in London. And look at the number of high rises, the number of buildings, because again, once you stop being able to accommodate growing populations by spreading out laterally, once you run out of British Island, then the only other way to go is up. And you start building taller and taller and taller buildings to accommodate the growing population that you are faced with. And all of that growth requires energy. It requires inputs of new sources of energy, which then can continue to increase population. And I'm not just picking on Britain. I just happen to have that picture of the Avabury stuff. It's also true in places like Hawaii, where you move from small community villages like the ancient Hawaiians had when they first landed on the islands to what Waikiki looks like today. Same thing. When you run out of island, you can't move laterally, so you start moving upwards and you start packing people in here. Population starts increasing. All of the people in all of the buildings that you see here are going to need food, they're going to need water, they're going to need energy. And the whole story is about where do you find those additional sources of food, those additional sources of water, those additional sources of energy to support those people. And so, what you're looking at here in microcosm is the global story of humanity. And this is not new, this is well known. But how we deal with it is new. And again, not to put the burden on you, but this will be a challenge for your generation to solve. My generation, again, probably should have, probably could have, but didn't. Whether it's because we're lazy, whether it's because we're entitled, hard to say. But the fact remains, here we are, and we're facing this problem. And the real kicker is going to come in the next few decades. I am hoping that solutions are found. I think it's likely that solutions are found. If you go back to Thomas Malthus, he would not have agreed. He was quoted in 1798 as saying the perpetual tendency of the race of man to increase beyond the means of subsistence is one of the general laws of animated nature, which we can have no reason to expect to change. In other words, Malthus saw humans as biological organisms who are going to exhibit eruptive growth. They're going to exceed the carrying capacity of their environments, and then there will be a catastrophic collapse. That was the whole point of his principle of population. But I would argue that we're no longer living in 1798 or in the time of Thomas Malthus, and that we are capable of perceiving the world, the resources available, and our place in it in a much more coherent and holistic way, and being able to address these challenges that we see coming down the pike, that we know are coming up. And because of our awareness of these issues, which hopefully for you has increased from this class during the course of this semester, hopefully by being aware of the issues, by seeing the challenges clearly and recognizing how we might move through them, we aren't constrained to be just like every other biological organism. We have the capacity to think ahead. we have the capacity to plan ahead. And so we are in a position to deal with this where no other organism could. So the question for your generation, for your future years is, are we simply a biological organism and are we completely constrained by our reproductive biology? Or are our intellects sufficient to resolve the issue and help us move past these challenges while still maintaining global populations? And that is where things stand at the moment. If you're interested in more about sustainability and what you can do, again, there is so much information online. There is so much information available to you. And there's so much that you can do now personally or as a community or as a voter. Um, but really, I hope that you get engaged because the future, your future, and the future of your children is really going to depend on this. And with that, we're at the end. I've given you everything I can give you, and we're at the end of the semester. I hope that you have learned something. I hope that maybe you've enjoyed this, and I want to thank you for your patience. It's been an unusual semester because of the online format. I really miss being able to interact with each of you. It's one of my favorite things about teaching is talking with students and engaging with students and listening to their views. And sadly, because of the way we have to teach online, that hasn't been an option. But I do hope you learned something. I hope maybe you enjoyed yourself. And I hope this helps you look at your futures and figure out how you want to proceed with things and how you want to live your lives in the years and decades to come. And with that, as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. And in the interim, please take care of yourselves. Please stay safe, stay healthy, and do your best to be good people because we need more good people out there. It's been a pleasure teaching you this semester. I hope you take care, and we'll see you down the road. Be good. Good night.